Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. 300 guests watched my own son shove me to the marble floor of our family's 150th anniversary gala. "You're nothing but a washed-up old Fed playing distiller, Dad," he shouted. "Enjoy watching your daughter-in-law go to prison for my $2.3 million mistake." I lay there for exactly 3 seconds, feeling 28 years of training settle back into my hands. So I stood up, brushed the dust off my jacket, and asked him one quiet question that made his face go white in front of everyone he'd ever tried to impress. What I hadn't decided yet was whether I could still call him my son after tonight. Let me take you back to where it started. Back to a phone call that came at 2:17 in the morning, 3 weeks before that gala. Before I'd decided anything, before I even understood what my own son had become. The phone rang twice before I reached it. My hand knew the weight of trouble before my mind caught up. Some instincts never retire, even after you've spent a decade pretending they did. "Dad!" Madeline's voice cracked on the single word. "I need you to come get us, please, right now."
"Where's Zoe?"
I was already sliding my feet into my boots. "With me. She's Dad. Please, just come." The line went dead before I could answer. That, more than anything, told me how bad it was. Madeline always says goodbye. Always. I didn't call her back. 28 years in federal law enforcement teaches you exactly one thing about calls like that. The why can wait. The leaving can't. I was already pulling my truck keys off the hook by the door, already running the drive time in my head. 11 minutes if the lights cooperated, 14 if they didn't. Irene stirred behind me in the dark. "Madeline?" I said, answering the question she hadn't asked yet. "Go back to sleep." She didn't. She never does. 41 years married to a man who used to disappear for weeks at a time will do that to a person. Teach a woman not to ask questions she isn't ready to hear the answers to. I backed the old Ford out of the barn without turning on the headlights until I hit the county road, a habit so old it wasn't even a decision anymore. Bardstown slept around me, dark and sweet-smelling, the rick houses standing like silent sentries along the ridge. I've made 100 drives through this town in my life. I don't remember a single one that felt like this. Here's the thing nobody tells you about getting old in a small town. People stop seeing you. The gas station clerk, the deputy at the four-way stop, my own grandson's teacher at the school fundraiser, they all look right through a 70-year-old man in a flannel shirt like he's part of the furniture. I used to hate that. Back when I still had something to prove. Now I use it, the way I once used a badge. I thought about Jason the whole drive over, though I didn't want to. Not about the boy who used to fall asleep in the rick house with sawdust in his hair, listening to me explain char levels like they were bedtime stories. I remembered the year I taught him to shake a man's hand and read his pulse at the same time, back when I still believed that was a skill worth passing down. He used it exactly once at a business dinner to guess how much a stranger's watch cost. About the man he'd become, instead the one who wore his grandfather's watch and none of his patience, who measured every room by how much it could be impressed. I told myself I was driving over because Madeline sounded scared. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. Somewhere under the worry, some old, cold part of me was already doing the math, sightlines, exits, how many minutes of daylight I had left before sunrise, whether the man I used to be would still fit inside the body I have now. That part of me had never really left. It had just been waiting for a reason to come back. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, dressed up to look like old money, the kind of place Jason had insisted on buying 2 years ago against every piece of advice Irene and I gave him. I let the truck coast the last 100 feet with my foot off the gas, the way I used to ease up on a Target's block back when engines had carburetors instead of computers to give you away. No neighbor's porch light flicked on. No dog barked. Whatever was happening inside that house, it hadn't spilled past the front door yet. Every window was dark except one upstairs, where a single light burned pale and unsteady behind the curtain. Jason's car wasn't in the driveway. That at least bought us time. I parked the truck at the curb instead of pulling in. Another old habit. You never block your own exit. I sat there a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, looking up at that one lit window. Without quite meaning to, I pressed 2 fingers to the inside of my own wrist. An old field habit. Counting my pulse against the ticking engine, the way I used to count a stranger's heartbeat through a handshake. Steady. Too steady, maybe, for a man about to walk into whatever was waiting behind that curtain. Something settled into place behind my ribs, something I hadn't felt in 10 years. It didn't feel like fear. It felt like waking up. I didn't knock. Some habits from getting people you love out of bad situations you never really unlearn, and knocking has never been one of the useful ones. The front door was unlocked, which told me almost as much as Madeline's voice had. In my day, we called that a tell. I stepped into the entryway just as footsteps pounded down the staircase, Madeline barefoot, a duffel bag half-zipped and dragging behind her like she'd forgotten it had a strap. She stopped dead when she saw me, one hand flying to her chest. The living room told its own story before anyone said a word. A drawer from the console table hung open at an angle, its contents, coasters, a ring of spare keys, a single black glove scattered across the rug like they'd been swept out in a hurry. A dining chair lay on its side near the kitchen doorway. Nobody had bothered to write it. Dad, thank God. She said it the way people say it when they've been holding their breath for an hour. Zoe was 2 steps behind her, clutching a stuffed rabbit so hard its ear had gone damp, her eyes darting from her mother to me and back like she was trying to figure out which one of us was going to tell her it was going to be okay. Nobody move fast, I said, keeping my voice low, calm, the way you talk to a spooked animal or a witness who hasn't decided yet whether to trust you. We've got time. We're just going to walk out to the truck together, nice and easy. Madeline nodded too many times, the kind of nodding that isn't agreement so much as motion to keep from falling apart. She crossed to the side table to grab Zoe's shoes, stepping around the half-zipped duffel bag she'd already dropped by the stairs. "What do you need from upstairs?" I asked her. 2 minutes. I'll go with you." "Nothing." She said it too fast. "There's nothing up there, Need." I let that sit. A man learns after enough years asking questions for a living exactly which answers are lies and exactly which lies are the kind you don't push on. Not yet. Not with a 9-year-old 3 feet away, holding a rabbit like a life preserver. She reached past me for a lamp cord to unplug it. Some old instinct toward tidiness even now, and her sleeve rode up an inch past her wrist. I saw it before she pulled the fabric back down. A bruise, 4 fingers wide, the color of a plum gone soft, right where a hand would close around a wrist. Not old, not new either. I didn't say anything about it. Not yet. I have interrogated men who put children in the ground. I have sat across metal tables from men who laughed about it. In none of those rooms did my hands feel the way they felt right now, standing in my own son's front hallway, looking at a bruise on my daughter-in-law's wrist. Something moved behind my ribs that I hadn't let move in a very long time. Something with teeth, and I put it away the same way I used to put away a weapon before walking into a room full of civilians. Carefully and completely so nobody watching could tell it had ever been there. Madeline. My voice stayed exactly where I wanted it. Slow, a little tired, an old man's voice. "Don't." She wouldn't look at me. "Please, Dad. Not right now. We just need to go." "Okay," I said, and meant it for now. There would be time for the real conversation later. There is always time for the real conversation later. That's what I told myself, walking out of rooms just like this one for 30 years. Zoe tugged my sleeve. "Grandpa." Her voice was so small I had to bend down to catch it. "Where are we going?" I crouched, knees complaining the way they always do lately, and looked her in the eye. "Someplace with a lot more stars than this one, sweetheart. Your grandmother's got the good blankets out, and I think there might be pie." She almost smiled. Almost. Then she looked past my shoulder toward the stairs, toward whatever room her father's absence still occupied. and the almost smile went out like a struck match. "Is Daddy coming too?" she asked, so quiet I almost missed it under the sound of Madeline zipping the bag. I didn't answer that one. Some questions you let the silence answer for you, because anything you say out loud to a 9-year-old becomes the true version of events in her memory forever. And I wasn't ready yet to decide what that version should be. "Ready?" I asked Madeline. "Ready." She zipped the bag the rest of the way and slung it over one shoulder, wincing slightly when the strap caught the same wrist. I picked up the duffel bag myself and nodded toward the door, already running the geometry of the driveway in my head. How many steps to the truck, which way the streetlight threw its shadows, whether the neighbor's hedge gave enough cover if we needed it. I told myself it was just an old man's habit, counting exits in a room out of nothing but reflex. I have never once believed my own excuses on that particular subject. For one full second, the house went perfectly still. No footsteps overhead, no traffic outside. Just the three of us standing in a hallway that didn't feel like anyone's home anymore. That was when I heard the key turn in the front door. The door swung open, and Jason filled the frame the way he filled every room he'd ever walked into, like the walls owed him rent. He saw me first. I watched the surprise cross his face, quick and involuntary, before he caught it and folded it into something uglier. "Well," he drew the word out, shrugging off a suit jacket that cost more than my truck's last 3 repairs combined, tossing it over the banister like the entryway was his personal stage. "Look who still drives that rust bucket. They make trucks with airbags now, Dad, just in case you ever hit something worth insuring." His eyes dropped to Zoe for half a second, the way a man glances at a piece of furniture he means to deal with later. "Shouldn't you be asleep, kiddo?" he said, not really asking, already looking past her again. He smelled like a casino floor cigarette smoke and cologne and something sweeter underneath that I didn't let myself name yet. Not at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, not for a man who'd told his wife he was in Nashville for a distributor meeting. "Jason." I kept my shoulders low, my voice a half step slower than my own, an old habit costume, worn so long it barely felt like acting anymore. "We were just heading out. Didn't want to wake you." "Heading out?" He looked past me to Madeline, to the bag on her shoulder, and whatever amusement had been on his face went out like a light switched off. "Heading out where, exactly?" Madeline's hand tightened on Zoe's shoulder. "To your father's, just for a few days. We talked about this, Jason." "We didn't talk about anything. You decided." He took a step toward her, and Zoe slid half behind my leg without anyone telling her to. "You walk out that door with my daughter Madeline, I promise you I will have a lawyer filing for full custody by 9 o'clock this morning. I'll tell the judge you're unstable. I'll tell him about the pills." "There are no pills." Her voice cracked on the word, thin as glass. "You know there are no pills, Jason. I know what I need a judge to believe." He said it so evenly, so reasonably, that for a moment it almost sounded like business advice. "There will be, once my lawyer's done filing the paperwork." He smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that had probably worked on every person who'd ever mattered less to him than money did. "And don't think I won't mention the missing export funds while I'm at it. $43,000 doesn't just evaporate, sweetheart. Not without somebody's signature on the paperwork." I felt Madeline go rigid beside me. Whatever those funds actually were, that number hit her like a slap across the face. "I've got bigger problems than you right now, old man," Jason said, rounding on me, some private panic flickering under the bravado for just a second before he buried it again. "Bigger than either of you could possibly understand. So do everyone a favor and get back in your truck." It was the flicker that stopped me more than the words did. I had spent 30 years learning to read that exact look on men twice as dangerous as my son. The look of someone doing math they couldn't make come out right. I filed it away and kept my hands loose at my sides, kept my spine bent the way an old man's spine bends. He reached out and closed his hand around Madeline's wrist, the same wrist I noticed, the same 4 fingers, and pulled her half a step toward him. Zoe made a small sound behind me, not quite a cry, and pressed her face into the back of my jacket. "You're not going anywhere." I moved then. Not fast, never fast. I shuffled forward the way a man with bad knees shuffles, and I set my hand on my son's shoulder, light as a leaf landing. "Son," I said, letting my voice tremble just enough, "let's not do this in front of the girls." He shrugged my hand off like it was nothing, like I was nothing, exactly the way I needed him to believe, and stepped back to give us room to pass, the way you step back from something that no longer registers as a threat. "Get out of my house, old man. We're going," I said, and this time my voice did shake, though not for the reason he thought. I turned, gathering Madeline and Zoe with an arm that looked unsteady and was not, guiding them past him toward the open door. My palm found his shoulder blade on the way by, resting there one final second, in a grip he would never in his life recognize as a hold 3 fingers, one specific angle, pressure applied and released before a man could even register it as pain, instead of a father's clumsy pat goodbye. It was a small thing. It was the only thing I let myself take from him that night. Outside, the porch light buzzed overhead, throwing that same pale, unsteady glow I'd watched from the truck 20 minutes earlier. Somewhere behind us, the door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. None of us said a word crossing the lawn. Zoe's hand found mine somewhere around the mailbox and didn't let go until we reached the truck, and I didn't let go either. Not until I'd buckled her into the back seat myself and checked the street twice in both directions, out of habit older than she was. I pulled away from the curb without turning on my headlights until we cleared the cul-de-sac, the same habit that had gotten us in undetected, getting us back out the same way. Madeline didn't say anything for the first mile. Then it all came out at once, the way water comes out of a cracked dam, not a trickle first, just everything, all together. "He controls the accounts," she said, staring straight ahead at the dark road. "All of them. I haven't had a checking account with my own name on it in 2 years. Last month, I needed $40 for Zoe's field trip, and I had to text him at his office and wait 4 hours for an answer." Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap, the knuckles had gone pale. "Every time I bring it up, he says I'm being ungrateful, that I don't understand what it takes to run a business like his." "You don't have to explain anything to me right now. I want to." Her voice was steadier than I expected, the way people get steady once the worst of the telling is behind them. "He goes to Nashville for distributor meetings 4 or 5 times a month. I stopped asking what those meetings actually are a long time ago. It was easier not to know." I let her talk. "I've spent 30 years learning that the fastest way to lose a witness is to interrupt one." In the mirror, Zoe's small face caught the passing streetlights every few seconds, peaceful in a way her mother hadn't looked in longer than any of us had noticed. "The bruise," she said finally, so quiet I almost missed it under the engine noise. "It's not the first time. It's just the first time I let it show." I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel, and I didn't say what I wanted to say, which was that I intended to make sure it was the last time, one way or another. Some promises you don't make out loud until you're certain you can keep them. That's when I noticed the headlights. They'd picked us up 2 blocks after the turn onto Route 9, a dark SUV keeping exactly 4 car lengths back, matching my speed to the mile an hour. When I slowed for a yellow light, it slowed. When I sped up, it sped up half a second later. The way a man does when he's trying not to look like he's paying attention. I didn't say anything to Madeline about it. In the back seat, Zoe had already fallen asleep against her rabbit, her breathing slow and even, and 30 years of instinct told me the last thing this child needed tonight was to wake up and feel her grandfather's fear. Madeline caught me checking the mirror a second time and went still. "What is it?" "Nothing," I said, and smiled the way you smile at somebody you're about to lie to for their own good. "Just an old man double-checking his blind spot." I took a right I didn't need to take. The SUV took it too, hanging back another half block, trying not to be obvious about it and failing the way amateurs always fail. Too much space, too little confidence, headlights a half-second slow on every turn. I ran us through the old grain co-op lot cut behind the hardware store where the delivery trucks always block the rear alley this time of night, and came out 3 streets over, doing the exact speed limit like a man with nowhere urgent to be. In the mirror, the road behind us stayed empty the whole rest of the way. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led up to the house, there were no headlights behind us at all. Just dark and the long stretch of fence line and the porch light Irene always left burning. She was standing on the steps before I'd even cut the engine, wrapped in the old cardigan she keeps by the door for exactly this kind of night, though I don't think either of us had ever quite pictured this particular version of it. She didn't ask where we'd come from. She didn't ask what happened. In 41 years of marriage, Irene has learned exactly when a question helps and exactly when it only adds weight to a load somebody's already struggling to carry. She came down the steps and gathered Madeline into her arms the way she used to gather Jason back before he decided he'd outgrown being held, and looked at me over her shoulder with a question in her eyes I wasn't ready to answer yet. I gave her the smallest shake of my head later, and she accepted it the way she'd accepted 1,000 versions of that same silent bargain over the years. I carried Zoe inside myself, still asleep, 40 pounds of trust I hadn't earned in years, and laid her down in the guest room under the quilt my mother made before any of this family's troubles had names. She stirred once, murmured something about stars, and settled back into sleep without ever fully waking. I stood over her for a moment longer than I needed to, the way you do with a sleeping child when the rest of the house feels like it's holding its breath, and let myself feel tired for exactly 5 seconds before I straightened my back and walked back out into whatever was waiting in the hallway. It was on my way past the kitchen that Madeline's phone lit up in my jacket pocket, where I'd been carrying it since the driveway. Jason's name filled the screen. I picked up on the second ring, keeping my voice pitched exactly the way it needed to be. Tired, a little frightened. An old man answering a phone he didn't want to be holding. "You think you're smart?" Jason said no greeting straight into it. His voice had the flat, hollow quality of a man talking himself into something he hadn't quite decided yet. "You think you can just take her out to your little farm and hide her there?" Jason, "I know where you live, old man. I've known where you live my whole life." There was a wet, ragged edge to his voice now, something underneath the anger that sounded almost like fear. "You send her back here tonight, or I swear to God I'll send people out to that property who won't knock first." The line went dead before I could answer, which was fine. I hadn't been planning to answer anyway. I've spent enough of my life listening to threats to know the ones worth taking seriously don't usually announce themselves twice. I sat in the dark kitchen a long while after that, turning the phone over in my hands, running the same calculus I used to run for a living, not whether a man meant what he said, but whether he had the means to act on it. Jason had never fired a gun in his life. He'd never had to. But desperate men borrow means they don't have, and I'd learned tonight that my son was a great deal more desperate than I'd let myself understand up until now. Irene had gone up to check on Madeline. The house had that particular late-night stillness that makes every small sound sharp enough to cut yourself on, which is exactly why I heard it the moment it happened. A crack of splintering wood, sharp and specific, carrying across the yard from the direction of the rick house. I was out the back door before I'd finished standing up. The night air hit cold and sweet with the smell of char and aging oak. A smell I've breathed my whole life and never once stopped loving, even now. Moving fast across wet grass toward a sound I already knew the shape of, a flashlight bobbed near the east wall of the rick house. Coda in his coat over pajama pants, kneeling beside something on the ground. He'd managed this rick house for 22 years, longer than Jason had been alive, and I'd never once seen him leave his cottage after dark without a reason worth losing sleep over. "Somebody was here," he said, before I'd even reached him, not looking up. "Heard the truck pull off the gravel, same time as the crash. Didn't get a plate, no lights on it at all." He stepped aside so I could see. One of the smaller barrels, nothing valuable 3 years in, meant for a blended batch, lay on its side against the wall, staved in on one end. The bourbon inside soaking dark into the dirt. Wrapped around a chunk of the broken stave, held on with electrical tape, was a folded scrap of paper. I picked it up and unfolded it under Coda's flashlight. 4 words, block letters pressed hard enough into the paper that I could feel the grooves with my thumb. Send her back now. I folded it once and put it in my shirt pocket next to the phone that had just delivered the same message out loud. You want me to call the sheriff, Mr. Williamson? Not yet. I looked past him down the long row of racked barrels stretching into the dark, each one numbered, dated, waiting on its own private clock. Somewhere down that row, 3rd rack from the end, sat a barrel with a girl's birth year chalked on the head, laid down the week she was born, resting for a birthday still 12 years off. The one with Zoe's date on it. It's fine. Coda glanced down the row like he could see it from here in the dark. Untouched, sir. They didn't get anywhere near it. I nodded, though something in the way he said it, a beat too quick, a little too certain for a man who hadn't actually checked, filed itself away in the part of my mind that never quite stopped filing things away, even after 10 years of trying to convince it to retire. I walked the length of the rack anyway, the way I do when something needs settling in my chest, running my palm flat across the char on each barrel head as I passed. A habit older than Jason, older than the badge, older than almost everything else about me that's still standing. Rough, even, exactly as it should be. I stopped at the one with the chalked date and let my hand rest there a moment longer than the rest. I stood there a moment longer in the ruined smell of good bourbon gone to waste, feeling the weight of that folded paper against my chest like it already knew something I didn't. Somewhere behind me, Coda was already sweeping up the broken stave with the patience of a man who'd cleaned up other people's messes his whole career and never once complained about it. Get some sleep, Coda. I'll deal with the rest of this in the morning. He nodded and didn't ask what dealing with it meant, which was its own kind of loyalty. I stood alone in the dark a while longer after he'd gone, looking down that long row of quiet barrels, each one holding its own small, patient piece of time. Maybe it was time to go get what I'd buried behind that workbench a long time ago. Irene found me in the workshop a few hours later, standing in front of a section of pegboard I hadn't touched in 10 years. You're not seriously... I am. I pulled the pegboard away from the wall on its hidden hinge, the mechanism stiff with disuse but still smooth enough to swing. Behind it sat the same steel safe I'd installed the summer Jason turned 12, back when I still believed I could keep 2 entirely separate lives running side by side forever without either one noticing the other. Jason used to sit on that exact workbench and watch me sand barrel staves, 12 years old, and already more interested in the price of things than the making of them. I remember telling him once that some of the best things a man builds he never gets to show anybody. I thought I was teaching him patience. I understand now I may as well have been teaching him to keep secrets. The dial still turned the way I remembered, 6 left, past 2 full turns right, to 9 left again, to the year Irene and I got married, a combination I'd never once written down anywhere a person could find it. The heavy door swung open with the same low groan it always had. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, dust-free somehow, as though some part of me had known this day was still coming and hadn't been willing to admit it. The badge sat on its square of velvet, tarnished but unmistakable, United States and an eagle, and a number that had been mine longer than my own son had been alive. Beside it, the gear, small black cases I hadn't looked at in a decade, and inside them technology that had probably been considered modern the last time I'd used it. I picked up the badge first. 31 years old the day I earned it, and I still remember the exact weight of it in my hand, heavier than a piece of metal that size has any right to be. I held it a long moment before I put it in my pocket, not because I needed to think about it, but because some decisions deserve exactly 1 full breath of silence before you make them irreversible. Behind the badge sat the vest, the comm gear, the small case of tools whose names I'd hoped never to need again, outside of a memory. The cameras were smaller than I remembered, or maybe my hands were just less steady than they used to be. I spent the better part of the morning working my way around the property, tucking them into the hollow of the old oak by the front gate, along the eaves of the rick house, angled down the length of the driveway, where anyone coming up it would have to pass through at least 3 fields of view before they ever reached the porch. Madeline watched me from the kitchen window for a while, a coffee mug forgotten in her hands, saying nothing. Zoe had woken, confused, and asked twice why Grandpa was up in a tree with a screwdriver, and both times I'd told her I was fixing a birdhouse, and both times she'd believed me, which was easier on both of us than the truth would have been. I was crouched under the eave outside the visitor center, running a wire behind the gutter, when I heard voices through the cracked office window above me. One of the marketing girls Jason had hired last spring, talking fast and cheerful into a phone. And we'll do the unveiling right at the toast before the fireworks. The really old stock, the 150th barrel. Jason wants press photos with the actual barrel head, not just a bottle. So make sure the lighting guy... The voice faded as she moved deeper into the office, already on to some other logistical detail about linen colors and a string quartet. I stayed crouched under that window a moment longer than the wiring required anyway, turning the phrase over the 150th barrel unveiled, photographed, toasted in front of every reporter and investor Jason could fit into a tent, filing it away next to everything else I hadn't decided what to do with yet. Irene came out to bring me coffee around noon, watching me loop the last length of cable through the fence post with an expression I recognized from 28 years of watching her watch me leave. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. "A long time ago. And you're good at it. You always were." She handed me the mug, wrapped both her hands around her own, and looked out at the fence line instead of at me the way she does when she's about to say something she needs to say without watching my face while she says it. "You disappeared for weeks at a time when he was little," she said. "Cases you couldn't talk about. Cases that changed something in you every single time, even when you tried not to let it show. I used to lie awake wondering which version of you would walk back through that door." She took a slow sip of her own coffee before she finished. "Have you thought about what it costs, Briggs? Not the camera wire, the rest of it. Have you thought about what you're actually prepared to lose to protect them?" I looked down the fence line at the cameras I'd just spent 4 hours hiding in plain sight at the badge, sitting in my shirt pocket like it had never left, and I understood exactly what she was really asking me underneath the words she'd chosen to ask it with. I didn't answer her. The knock came at 1:30, 3 sharp raps that had nothing casual about them. I opened the door already knowing, in the specific way you know these things after 28 years of being the man who delivered exactly this kind of knock to exactly this kind of doorstep. A young man in a plain gray suit stood on the porch holding a thick manila envelope against his chest like a shield. "Madeline Williamson, that's my daughter-in-law." I kept my body between him and the door. "She's not available right now." "Understood, sir. I just need to confirm she resides at this address." He glanced down at a clipboard, unbothered, a man who'd delivered 1,000 of these and would deliver 1,000 more before he retired. It wasn't personal to him. That was somehow worse than if it had been. He didn't argue when I didn't answer. He just held the envelope out toward me instead, the way process servers learn to do it so the handoff can never quite be refused. "Then I'll leave it with you, sir. She's been served." He was back in his car before I'd even broken the seal. Madeline came out onto the porch behind me, drawn by the sound of the car door, and I saw the exact moment she understood what she was looking at. Irene appeared a half-second later with Zoe's hand in hers, took one look at both our faces, and steered the girl toward the barn to look at the goats without a single word of explanation needed. I opened the folder at the kitchen table. Madeline sat across from me, hands flat on the wood, like she was trying to hold the table itself steady. "Civil complaint. Plaintiff, Williamson and Sons Export Holdings. Defendant, Madeline Williamson. Count 1, embezzlement." The number sat there in black and white, typed and retyped, until it stopped looking like an accusation and started looking like a fact. $2,300,000. "That's not..." Madeline's voice broke apart before she could finish the sentence. "Dad, that's not possible. I've never had access to $2 million in my life. I don't even know what fund this is." She pushed back from the table so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor, both hands pressed to her temples now, pacing a tight circle by the window. They're going to think I did this. A jury, a judge, anybody who reads this cold. They're going to look at this and think I stole $2 million from my own family. I flipped to the exhibits. Wire authorizations, account transfer forms. Every single page ended the same way in the same tight, forward-leaning signature, Madeline Williamson. 6 letters and a flourish under the W that I'd watched her sign 100 times on birthday cards and school permission slips. I signed some of this. She was staring at one particular page now, both hands pressed flat against her mouth. I remember signing something like this. He told me it was insurance paperwork for the new bottling line. I didn't read it, Dad. He hands me things to sign all the time. It's never... How many pages did he hand you? I don't know, 10, 15? Over the last year, maybe more? Her breath was coming too fast now, shallow catching. He said I trusted him too little already, that reading every single page felt like an insult after everything he'd given me. I noticed she still said it that way, everything he'd given me, even now sitting across from a document accusing her of federal-scale theft on his behalf. Some habits of the heart take longer to break than the law ever will. I laid 3 of the signature pages side by side under the kitchen light and looked at them the way I used to look at forged documents for a living, back when a man's freedom sometimes rode on whether I could see what everybody else missed. I'd spent 2 full years of my career assigned to a financial crimes unit before they moved me over to counterfeit spirits and trafficking cases, long enough to sit through more handwriting analysis training than most working examiners ever get to, and long enough to know exactly how much a good forgery could fool an untrained eye, and exactly where it would still fail. The signatures were good. Whoever had produced them understood pressure points, understood the natural hesitation before the W, understood that a real signature never looks quite as clean as a forged one tries to. Most people faking a name they'd studied rush the parts that feel difficult and slow down on the parts that feel easy, and this forger had made exactly that mistake, just well enough hidden that a judge skimming a stack of exhibits would never catch it. But a signature isn't just a shape. It's a rhythm, a speed, a set of habits built over decades of writing the same 6 letters. And rhythm is the one thing a forger can copy from a photograph, but never quite steal from the hand that made it. I pulled an old grocery list from Madeline's handbag, one she'd scrawled her name across the top of that same morning, and set it beside the exhibit pages. Side by side, the difference stopped being subtle at all. I set the pages down and looked up at my daughter-in-law's terrified face. "This isn't your signature, Madeline." She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "It's close, it's very good, but it's not yours." I folded the top sheet closed, feeling something cold and very familiar settle into the base of my spine. And I think I already know exactly whose hand made it. I waited until Madeline and Irene had Zoe settled with a movie in the den before I carried the phone into my study and shut the door. The lawsuit sat on the desk in front of me, its stack of forged pages squared off neatly at the corners, the way I always used to leave case files before I picked up a phone that mattered. Rowan Howard's number was still in my address book, unchanged in 8 years, filed under a name I hadn't said out loud in just as long. I sat looking at it for a full minute before I dialed. Some debts you let sleep as long as you possibly can, out of respect for the man who owes them as much as anything else. He picked up on the 4th ring right before I expected it to roll to voicemail, with the wary caution of a man screening an unfamiliar caller before he even says hello. "This is Rowan." "Rowan, it's Briggs Williamson." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know about whether he remembered. "Briggs." His voice changed entirely, the careful lawyer's caution dropping away all at once. It's been years. Is everything all right?" I could hear faintly the particular quality of a Louisville law office in the background, a phone ringing somewhere down a hallway, the soft click of a door. 22 years ago, his father's distillery had gotten tangled up with men who used small family operations exactly like his to move dirty money through legitimate-looking barrel sales, and by the time Rowan's father understood what he'd agreed to, the men running the operation had already made it clear what happened to families who tried to walk away. I'd led the task force that took the whole thing apart, barrel by barrel, wire transfer by wire transfer, until the men behind it had nowhere left to hide their money or themselves. I'd also spent 3 nights personally parked outside a 19-year-old law student's apartment in an unmarked sedan with cold coffee and a service weapon on the passenger seat, because somebody had decided the easiest way to keep a distillery owner quiet was to remind him what or who he stood to lose. Rowan had never forgotten it. I'd never brought it up again in the 8 years since, because a man who has to remind someone of a debt isn't really owed one anymore. Not entirely all right now. I kept my voice level and even the way I used to brief a room full of people whose entire job it was to stay calm, no matter what I told them. I need a favor, the kind you don't bill hours for. Anything. No hesitation in it at all. What do you need? I told him. Not everything, not the bruise, not the phone calls, not the note wrapped around a broken stave, just the shape of it. My son, a fraudulent lawsuit, a forged signature, good enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking for it, targeting a woman who'd never had a checking account of her own in 2 years. $2.3 million, Rowan repeated slow, like he was writing the number down somewhere in his head to make sure it was real. And you're telling me Jason's the one who filed it? His company, his lawyer. I'd bet my last dollar it was his idea. Rowan was quiet through most of the rest of it, the particular quiet of a man taking notes he wasn't writing down. The kind of silence I remembered well from the other side of an interrogation table. "Send me everything you've got," he said when I finished. "All business now." The sound of a pen already moving across paper somewhere on his end. "Every page of that complaint, every exhibit, tonight if you can manage it. I want my own people looking at those signatures by morning, and I want a forensic accountant on Jason's company filings before the week is out. There's more. I need everything on Jason's finances, the company accounts, anything that isn't just the surface. If he's willing to forge his own wife's signature over $2.3 million, I don't think this is the first time in his life he's needed money he doesn't actually have." I heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man recalibrating exactly how large the problem in front of him actually was. "Don't do anything with Jason directly yet," I told him. "Not a phone call, not a letter, not so much as a paralegal returning a stray email. Nothing that tells him we're looking. I want to understand the whole shape of this before he has any idea anyone's watching him at all." "Understood." A pause and then quieter. "Briggs, whatever this turns into, I owe you this, and about 100 more like it. You know that." "You don't owe me anything." "I do," he said, "and I'm collecting it now, whether you want me to or not." He let that sit a moment, the two of us listening to each other breathe over 120 miles of phone line. "How's Irene?" "Worried. Better than she's letting on." "And the little one, Zoe?" "Asleep last I checked. She doesn't know any of this yet." "Good." Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, there was something new underneath the lawyer's steadiness, something almost like dread. "Give me 3 days, Briggs. After that, you're not going to recognize the boy you think you know." I made one more call before I let myself sleep short, to a number even older than Rowan's, belonging to a man who'd spent 30 years reading the parts of a financial ledger nobody else thinks to look at. Bobby Guzman had retired from the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division around the same time I hung up my own badge, and we'd crossed paths on a joint task force or two, back when our two agencies still pretended to share information willingly. If there's one thing federal financial crimes work teaches a man, it's that money never actually disappears. It just gets embarrassed and goes into hiding. I told him what I needed and went to bed without an answer, though I already knew sleep wasn't coming for me that night. Irene breathed slow and even beside me, worn out from a day that had asked more of all of us than any of us had reserves for. I lay there, staring at the ceiling fan doing its slow, patient circles, running numbers in my head that I didn't have yet, The way a mind trained a certain way keeps working long after you've asked it politely to stop. It was nearly midnight when my phone finally lit up on the nightstand. "Briggs, sorry to wake you at this hour." Bobby's voice had none of its usual warmth in it tonight. None of the easy joking that had carried us through more late-night calls than I could count over the years we'd known each other. "You awake?" "I am now. I ran your boy's name through everything I could still legally touch, and some things I probably shouldn't have touched at all." A pause, the particular pause of a man deciding how much to soften before he delivers something ugly. "Briggs, your son is in deep with some very serious people, for a very serious amount of money." I sat up in the dark, swinging my feet to the floor before I'd even decided to move them. "How serious?" "I'm still tracing the full picture, but conservatively, north of 2 million. Markers at 3 different operations, all of them eventually running back through the same man. Goes by Titan Rivas. Runs high-stakes card rooms and a lending operation out of a strip of storage units off I-71 north of Louisville. The kind of lending operation where the interest rate isn't the part that should scare you." I sat with that a moment, letting the number settle the way you let a diagnosis settle before you ask the doctor to repeat it. $2 million. On top of the $2.3 million he'd already tried to pin on his own wife. Nearly $4.5 million of trouble wearing my family's last name like it still meant something to him. My son had built himself a hole so deep he'd started using the people he loved as ladders out of it. I'd interviewed men who worked for people like Titan Rivas back in another life, in rooms with no windows and a lot of patience on both sides of the table. I knew exactly what kind of men collected on a debt like that, and exactly what happened to people who couldn't pay it. "There's something else," Bobby said, and I could hear him shuffling papers on his end, the particular rustle of a man who still printed everything, even now 20 years into the digital age. Going back through Jason's business email, the parts that got swept up in a subpoena from an unrelated matter a while back, don't ask me how, I still have access to it. There's a name that keeps showing up. Not a full name, just initials. JR. "That mean anything to you?" "Not yet. Shows up 11 times over the last 4 months, always tied to shipment logistics. Never a full signature, never a company name attached." I heard him tap his pen against the desk, the same nervous rhythm he'd had since I'd known him. "Whoever this is, they're being careful. More careful than a man who forges his own wife's signature has any right to be around, which tells me somebody smarter than Jason is standing just behind him, keeping him upright. Any pattern to when the initials show up? Always right before a shipment date. I'd guess this JR is either buying something from your son's company or moving something through it. Either way, they're a name on a manifest somewhere, and manifests eventually connect to real people with real faces and real addresses. I felt the shape of the thing starting to assemble itself in the dark, the way cases used to assemble themselves at 2 in the morning back when this kind of call was still my job, instead of my personal nightmare. Pieces that didn't mean much on their own, arranging themselves slowly into an outline I didn't like the look of at all. "Bobby." I kept my voice steady, though nothing else in me felt steady at all. "Where's a man like Jason getting the kind of money it takes to owe $2 million to a loan shark in the first place? He's vice president of a bourbon company, not a hedge fund." The line went quiet for a moment longer than it should have, long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "That," Bobby said finally, slow and careful, like a man setting down something he wasn't sure was safe to hold, "is the part I haven't figured out yet, but I will. Give me a couple more days, and don't do anything with Jason until I do." 3 nights passed quietly enough that the house almost started to feel normal again. Madeline began sleeping through until morning. Zoe stopped asking when we were going home and started asking whether the goats had names yet, which felt in its own small way like progress. I kept the badge in my pocket and said nothing to either of them about cameras or Rowan or the sum of money now sitting somewhere north of $4 million behind my son's easy smile. Then the monitor in my study lit up again. Motion detected at the loading dock behind the visitor center. Not the driveway, not the rick house, a part of the property Jason still had every right to be on, which was exactly what made it worth watching closely. It was a few minutes past 11. I muted the volume on the television, though nobody else was awake to hear it, and pulled up the feed on the laptop Rowan's investigator had helped me set up 2 nights earlier. Jason's car was already parked at an angle across 2 spaces, the way a man parks when he isn't planning to be here long enough to care about lines. He stood beside a black sedan I didn't recognize, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, shoulders up around his ears against the cold. The second man stepped out of the sedan, slow and unhurried, the way people move when they've never once had to rush for anyone. Silver hair, a wool coat that fit him the way expensive things fit people who'd worn expensive things their whole lives, shoes that caught the loading dock floodlight and threw it back, polished and sharp. Nothing about him matched what I'd pictured when Bobby said the words, "loan shark." This was not a man who broke kneecaps in parking lots. This was a man who had other people do that from a very comfortable distance, and had likely never once raised his own voice to accomplish anything in his entire life. I'd spent enough years sitting across tables from men exactly like him to recognize the type without ever needing his name. The truly dangerous ones rarely look dangerous at all. The ones who look dangerous are usually just the help. I turned up the audio as far as the feed allowed, which wasn't nearly far enough. Most of it came through as wind noise and half syllables, but one full sentence carried clean across the lot close enough to the camera that I heard every word of it twice when I played it back. "We need to push the shipment up," the stranger said, unhurried, the way a man asks for something he already knows he'll get. "Before the end of the month, not after. My people are getting impatient, waiting on your father's good name to finish doing its work for us." Jason said something back, too quiet for the microphone to catch his whole posture folding in on itself the way it had at the front door the night I came for Madeline. Smaller somehow than the man who filled every room he'd ever walked into back before any of this began. The stranger patted him once on the shoulder, the exact gesture of a man reassuring an employee, and got back into the sedan without another word. Taillights swept across the lot and disappeared down the county road. I sat there a long while after the screen went dark, running the footage back 3 more times, trying to pull a clear angle on the stranger's face out of grain and floodlight and bad luck. I never quite managed it. Whoever he was, he'd stood at exactly the angle a careful man stands at when he already knows there might be cameras nobody's supposed to notice. Chin down, collar up, a professional's instinct for staying unremarkable, even when he had no particular reason to expect an audience. I zoomed in on the one clear frame I did manage to pull, a 3/4 profile, caught for less than a second as he turned back toward the sedan. It told me almost nothing useful. A well-kept man in his 50s or 60s, unremarkable in every way that mattered for identification, remarkable only in how carefully and deliberately unremarkable he'd made himself over what was probably a very long career. Your father's good name. I turned that phrase over more times than I turned over anything else from that night. Not the money, not the shipment, the name. As though the Williamson name itself was collateral in whatever Jason had gotten himself into 150 years of my family's reputation quietly pledged against a debt I hadn't even known existed a week ago. My grandfather built that name barrel by barrel, one honest bottle at a time, through 2 recessions and a fire that nearly took the whole rick house down in 1961. It had never once in a century and a half been used as collateral for anything. Until now. I sent the footage and the audio to Rowan before I let myself sleep, along with a still frame of the stranger's face, useless as it was. He called at 7 the next morning, exactly on the schedule he'd promised 3 days before, though his voice carried none of the business-like calm it had carried the first time we spoke. "Briggs." A pause, the kind that told me everything before he said another word. "We need to talk. In person if you can manage it. There are some things I don't want to say over an open line, and I don't think you're going to want to hear them secondhand from anyone but me." Rowan's office occupied the top floor of a converted tobacco warehouse near the river. All exposed brick and steel beams, dressed up in mahogany furniture that probably cost more than my truck. He didn't stand when I came in. He didn't offer coffee or small talk or any of the courtesies I remembered from 22 years of knowing him. He just slid a folder across the desk and said, "Sit down, Briggs." I sat. Through the window behind him, I could see the river running slow and brown in the afternoon light. A barge making its way downstream with the kind of patience nothing in this room seemed to have anymore. I need you to look at this before I explain it, because I want you to see it the way a judge would see it, cold, without me softening it first. He opened the folder himself and turned it to face me. "Do you recognize this entity, Williamson Global Export Solutions, LLC? No. Nobody would. It was formed 11 months ago, registered in Delaware, no physical office, no employees on paper except one." He tapped the second page with one finger, a small, precise gesture. "Chief Compliance Officer. Look at the name." I looked. Madeline Williamson, printed in the same clean corporate font as the entity name above it, 6 letters and a title that turned a woman who couldn't get a checking account approved into the legal face of a $2 million export operation she'd never once heard of. I read the name 3 times before it fully landed. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room when you're looking at proof of something you already suspected but hadn't let yourself believe yet. "She's never mentioned this to you," Rowan said. It wasn't a question. "She's never heard of it. I'd stake my life on that." I believe you. I also believe that doesn't matter nearly as much as it should. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched Rowan Howard look genuinely afraid on somebody else's behalf. Briggs, a compliance officer, isn't a ceremonial title. Legally, it's the person who attests that a company's financial reporting is accurate. It's the name regulators go looking for first when something doesn't add up. It's the name that goes on an indictment before anybody bothers asking who actually moved the money. Something cold settled into my chest. The specific cold of watching a shape finally resolve itself out of fog. "He's not just hiding money through this company," I said slowly, working it through out loud the way I used to work through a case file with a squad room full of tired people waiting on me. "He's built himself an exit. That's exactly what he's built. If federal auditors ever come looking, and given what you've told me about Titan Revis, I'd assume that's a matter of when, not if, every wire transfer, every falsified export document, every dollar that ever passed through that LLC has Madeline's name legally attached to it as the person responsible for catching exactly this kind of fraud. Jason's name barely appears in the filings at all. He made sure of that. He's not on a single officer document I've been able to find." "The lawsuit," I said, "the embezzlement complaint, is step 1. Rowan's voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the voice of a man delivering the part of the diagnosis he'd been saving until he was certain of it. "If she panics and settles it, she'll sign something admitting partial responsibility for the company's finances just to make the lawsuit go away. That admission becomes the foundation stone for everything that comes after. He's not trying to punish her, Briggs. He's building the paper trail that lets him walk away clean when this whole thing collapses, and it is going to collapse. Whoever your mystery man on the loading dock footage turns out to be, men like that don't extend timelines out of kindness." I sat with that a long moment, looking at my daughter-in-law's name typed in careful official letters on a document she had never once laid eyes on. "He's not just failing to protect her," I said mostly to myself. "He's preparing to sacrifice her." Rowan didn't argue with the word. He let it sit there in the room between us exactly as heavy as it deserved to be. I thanked him, and I meant it, though the words came out flatter than I intended. I drove the hour and a half back to Bardstown in almost total silence, the radio off, the folder sitting on the passenger seat like it weighed considerably more than paper had any right to weigh. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the truck a while, looking out past the house toward the long, dark row of the Rick house, thinking about a 9-year-old girl's initials chalked on a barrelhead, and a mother who still didn't know how close she'd come to losing everything for a crime she'd never committed. Through the kitchen window, I could see Madeline moving around the counter, setting a plate down in front of Zoe, laughing at something the girl had said. Ordinary. Unaware. Exactly the way Jason needed her to stay for whatever came next, to work the way he'd planned it. I sat there a long moment longer, watching my family through a pane of glass they didn't know I was studying, and understood with absolute clarity that whatever I decided to do next, I no longer had the luxury of doing it slowly. Coda knocked on the study door 2 mornings later, a leather ledger tucked under one arm, not quite meeting my eyes when I opened it. "Got a minute, Mr. Williamson?" I knew before he said another word that whatever he'd found had cost him something to bring me. Coda didn't come to the house. In 22 years, he'd never once come to the house. We walked out to the rick house together in silence, past the 3rd rack from the end, and I found myself thinking, unbidden, of a summer afternoon 8 years back, Zoe, barely a year old, propped on my hip, her small hand slapping flat against the warm oak of a freshly filled barrel, while I chalked the date onto the head, her birth year. 21 years until she'd be old enough to drink what we were putting away for her that day. She'd laughed at the sound her palm made against the wood, that particular hollow thump, and demanded I do it again and again until Irene finally called us both in for supper. I remember telling Irene later that night it felt like writing a letter to someone who hadn't been born long enough to read it yet. Coda stopped in front of that same barrel now and opened his ledger to a page marked with a torn strip of masking tape. "I went back through 18 months of transfer logs," he said, "cross-referencing barrel numbers against what actually left the property versus what the paperwork says left. Took me the better part of 2 nights working after everybody else had gone home." He turned the ledger so I could see it. "This one's logged as moved to secondary storage for humidity control 14 months ago. Moved back 3 weeks later. Numbers match, dates match. But I run humidity control myself, Mr. Williamson. Nothing's ever been moved to secondary storage in the whole time I've worked here. There is no secondary storage. I made that building up on the form because Jason told me to back before I understood what I was actually filling in for him." He closed the ledger and held it against his chest like it might do something on its own if he let go of it. "I've never once had to choose between my job and telling you the truth before now. Didn't much care for finding out I had to." I stood very still. "Open it," I said. It took the 2 of us to walk the barrel forward on its rack and pull the bung. Coda worked the tool with hands that had done this 1,000 times, careful and unhurried even now. And for a long moment, the 2 of us just stood there in the quiet, waiting. The way you wait outside an operating room for news you've already half decided you don't want. The smell hit first. Wrong. Thinner than it should have been, sharper, missing the deep vanilla and oak weight of 9 years in char, the unmistakable smell of a young, cheap blend, dressed up in an old barrel to pass a glance. It was never going to survive a real taste test. I dipped the Valinch and drew off a sample anyway, held it to the light. Pale. Too pale by years. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Rowan, a text the kind he only sent when he didn't trust himself to wait for a call. The manifest for the loading dock shipment finally cleared. Recipient of record J. Rubio, Fine and Rare Spirits, Lexington. Same man from your footage. I pulled his business license photo. It's him. Justice Rubio. A name now where there had only been a well-tailored coat and a careful angle away from the camera in a floodlit parking lot just a few nights ago. A name attached to a company that bought and sold rare bourbon to collectors who would never think to question a bottle's provenance if the label looked old enough and the story sounded good enough. Men with more money than patience paying premium prices for a piece of history that had never actually spent a single day aging the way the label claimed. My son had drained his own daughter's birthday out of a barrel, replaced it with something cheap and false, and sold what he'd taken to a stranger, all to buy himself a few more weeks with a man who broke people for a living. He hadn't just stolen from her future, he'd emptied it out and left the shell standing exactly where I'd taught him it should stand, so that none of us would ever think to check. I lowered myself onto the cold dirt floor of the rick house in front of the empty barrel, and I did not get back up for a long time. The overhead light hummed. Somewhere above us, a swallow that had gotten into the rafters months ago and never found its way back out shifted against the beam wings, rustling once, then still. Coda set the ledger down without a word and walked back out into the daylight, leaving me alone with the barrel and the smell of something that was never going to be what it was supposed to be. I don't know how long I knelt there. Long enough that my knees had gone past aching into numb. Long enough that the light through the east door moved a full hand's width across the dirt floor, slow and indifferent the way sunlight moves whether or not a man's whole understanding of his own sun has just come apart underneath it. I said nothing. There was nothing in me yet that had turned into words. Irene woke a little after 3 and found my side of the bed empty and already cold. She didn't call out for me. In 41 years, I don't think she's ever once called out for me in the dark. She just got up, put on her robe, and walked the path she already knew I'd taken, because there is only ever one place I go when something in me needs settling. The grass was wet with the beginnings of dew cold enough through her house slippers that she'd remember it later and wish she'd stopped for boots. She didn't stop. She never has, not for me. She found me in the rick house, standing at the small workbench near the door. A row of empty bottles lined up in front of me, corking a batch of last month's small run, one at a time, by hand. The single bulb over the bench threw a small, warm circle of light. Everything past its edge sat in shadow, the racks, the rafters, the dark shape of the barrel 3 rows down that neither of us needed to look at to know was still there, still open, still empty. I didn't hear her come in. I felt her the way you feel a familiar weight enter a room, even with your back turned, and I didn't stop what I was doing. She didn't ask why I was awake. She didn't ask about Coda or the ledger or the barrel 3 racks down that still sat open and empty where we'd left it. She already knew enough, and the rest could wait until I had words ready to carry it. She pulled the second stool up beside the workbench, set 2 mugs of coffee down between us, and sat patient as she has always been patient, which is to say, entirely. I corked another bottle. The sound it made, that soft, final push of cork meeting glass, was the only sound in the whole building for a long while. Cork. Set the bottle down. Reach for the next one. Irene didn't touch her coffee. She just watched my hands work the way she's watched my hands work through every hard year of our marriage, patient, in a way I've never once deserved, and never once known how to properly thank her for. Steam rose off both mugs and thinned into nothing. Cork. Set the bottle down. Reach for the next one. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me distantly, the way small, true things surprise you on nights when nothing else feels true at all. Somewhere outside, an owl called twice and went quiet. The rick house smelled the way it always smells at that hour, oak and char and something sweet underneath a smell I've loved since before I could talk, a smell that had somehow, without my noticing exactly when, become the smell of everything I'd failed to protect. I thought, without meaning to, of my own father standing at this same bench 40 years ago, teaching me to feel for the seat of a cork with my fingertips instead of watching for it with my eyes. Trust your hands, Briggs. Your eyes lie to you before your hands ever will. I wondered what he would have made of tonight. I decided, somewhere in the corking of the 9th bottle, that I already knew, and that I didn't want to sit with the answer any longer than I had to. I finished the row. 12 bottles corked and standing in a neat line, catching the single overhead bulb in 12 small points of amber light. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold and I drank it anyway, both hands wrapped around the mug, the way Zoe wraps her hands around a mug of cocoa, like the warmth of a thing matters more than its temperature. Briggs. Just my name, nothing else. She has always known exactly how much to say and exactly when to stop saying it. A skill I've spent 41 years admiring and never once managed to learn for myself. I looked at the bottles instead of at her. His father, I said, taught him that money could buy anything worth having. My voice came out rougher than I expected, worn thin from a night that had asked more of it than it had left to give. I was that father, Irene. I never once taught him the other half of it. I never once sat him down and told him some things can't be bought, and some things, once you sell them, don't come back, no matter what you're willing to pay. Irene didn't say I told you so. She had every right to. She'd said almost exactly that to me a dozen times over the years, in a dozen gentler ways, every time I came home from another absence with my hands full of overtime pay and my son a little more of a stranger to me than he'd been the week before. She just reached over and put her hand flat against my back, the way you'd steady something that had started finally to lean. We sat like that a long while, her hands still resting against my back. Neither of us in any hurry to be the one who moved first. The bulb over the bench hummed its steady, low hum. Somewhere down the row, a barrel settled with a soft, deep tick. The sound old wood makes when it's simply doing what old wood does, indifferent to anything happening around it. Neither of us said anything else for a long time. There wasn't anything else that needed saying yet. Coda called before 8 the next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee at the kitchen table, his voice carrying an urgency I'd never once heard from him in 22 years working together. "Mr. Williamson, I need you out at the Rick House. Now, if you can." He was waiting for me at the far end of the row, past where Zoe's barrel still stood open from the night before, standing in front of a different barrel entirely, one marked with a red ribbon around the bung, the kind we reserve for anything scheduled to be poured at a public event. "This is the 150th barrel," Coda said, not waiting for me to ask. "The one for the gala unveiling. I checked it last night after you'd gone in, just to be thorough, because I couldn't sleep either." His eyes were red-rimmed, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent the whole night carrying something he couldn't set down. "Figured if one barrel got touched, I owed it to this place to check the others marked for anything public." And he didn't answer with words. He just handed me the Valent she'd already drawn a sample with, and I held it up to the light the same way I had the night before, already knowing before the color even registered what I was going to find. Pale. Thin. Wrong. "If somebody pours this in front of the press at that gala," Coda said quietly, "in front of every distributor and investor Jason's been courting for a year, they're going to know inside of 30 seconds. Any collector, any real bourbon writer, anybody who's ever had a proper pour in their life is going to taste that and know exactly what it isn't." I stood there a long moment, feeling the shape of the problem shift under my feet. This was no longer a private matter between a father and a son who'd lost his way. This was 150 years of the Williamson name about to collapse in front of cameras in a room full of the exact people whose good opinion Jason had built his entire fraud around keeping. And somewhere underneath that thought sat another one, quieter and colder, that Jason needed this gala to go perfectly, which meant that whatever happened between now and then, he would not let anything stand in the way of it. Not Madeline, not Zoe, not me. I called Rowan from the truck on the drive back to the house, and I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need that export account frozen. Today. Not next week, not when the paperwork's convenient. Today." Briggs freezing an account that size on the evidence we have is going to send up a flare Jason can't miss. He'll know somebody's looking. Once that happens, we lose whatever advantage there is in him not knowing. "I'm aware." My voice came out flatter and harder than I intended the voice I used to use on rooms full of people who needed to move fast whether they liked it or not, no matter how they felt about it. I'd rather he know we're looking than let him stand up at that gala in 10 days and hand a glass of stolen bourbon to a room full of reporters and investors. "Freeze it, Rowan. Today." There was a pause longer than I liked, and then quieter. "Understood. I'll have the injunction filed by this afternoon, and I'll call you the second it goes through." Madeline was at the kitchen table when I walked back in, feeding Zoe breakfast, and she read something in my face before I'd said a single word. "Zoe, sweetheart, go brush your teeth for me," she said, and waited until the girl's footsteps had faded up the stairs before she turned back to me. "What happened?" I told her a version of it. Not all of it out the barrel with her daughter's name chalked on the head. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly how to say that particular thing without breaking something in her I wasn't sure could be put back together. Just enough. The company with her name on it, the frozen account, the gala and what was riding on it now. She sat very still through most of it, hands wrapped around her mug, the same way I'd wrapped mine around coffee gone cold 12 hours before. When I finished, she didn't cry and didn't ask the questions I'd braced myself to answer. She just stared at a point somewhere past my shoulder for a long moment, doing the same kind of math I'd been doing all morning. "He's going to find out someone's looking," she said finally. "And when he does, he's going to come apart, Dad. I've seen him come apart before. It isn't quiet when it happens." I know. If I tell Zoe any of this now as she asks me why we're not going home, why her father hasn't called, and I finally tell her the truth instead of another story about goats and pie. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together until it steadied. "She loses both of them at once, Dad. Her father and whatever she still believes about what a family is supposed to look like. I don't know how to take that away from her before I absolutely have to." I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there was one to have. I sat down across from her instead, and for a while, neither of us tried to find one. We hosted the pre-gala family dinner 3 nights later, the same as we had every year, for as long as I could remember, a tradition older than either of my parents, meant to bring the family together before the distillery's biggest week of the calendar. Irene set the table with the good china, the way she always does, because appearances matter more than any of us like to admit, and because Zoe deserved one evening that looked like the one she remembered from before any of this started. This year, nobody wanted to host it. Everybody came anyway. Rowan's injunction had gone through 2 days earlier. Jason hadn't called to ask why. That silence had worried me more than any accusation would have. Jason arrived exactly on time, freshly pressed, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than the whole meal probably would, and for the first 20 minutes he performed the version of himself he wanted us to see so convincingly that I almost admired the craft of it, laughing too loud at his own jokes, talking through the gala's marketing rollout with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing at all riding on any of it, refilling everyone's glass before they'd asked, the exact performance of a man determined to prove nothing was wrong by insisting on it loudly enough. Madeline matched him beat for beat, asking the right questions at the right moments, and if I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed the two of them were simply a couple weathering an ordinary rough patch. Irene watched him the way she used to watch patients in triage, cataloging things the rest of us weren't trained to see. I caught her eyes on the fine sheen of sweat at his hairline, though the dining room sat a comfortable 68 degrees. I caught her noting the way his knee bounced under the table, a rhythm with no music behind it. The small, telltale signs of a man running on adrenaline and very little sleep. "Business must be good," I said, keeping my voice light, setting my fork down between bites. "Heard the export numbers were up last quarter." Jason's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did one full beat of stillness before he answered. "They're solid. Growing market. You know how it is." "Funny," I said. "I heard there was some trouble with a shipment. Delays, maybe. Somebody mentioned it at the co-op." "Where'd you hear that?" Too fast, too sharp, the mask slipping for just a fraction of a second before he pulled it back into place. "Small town." I shrugged an old man's shrug, harmless. "People talk. You know how it is, too." He recovered well enough to change the subject to the gala's guest list, but I watched his hand find his water glass and grip it a fraction too hard, knuckles going pale around the stem. Zoe, who had been quietly rearranging peas on her plate for most of the meal, chose that exact moment to look up. "Daddy, is my barrel still there? The one with my birthday on it?" The table went very still. Jason's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it for a long moment, his eyes flicking to me, to Madeline, back to his daughter's small, waiting face. "Of course it is, sweetheart," he said finally, too bright, too quick, the exact tone of a man lying to a child for the first time and hating how easily it came. "Why do you ask?" "Grandpa was out in the Rick house a lot lately. I thought maybe you moved it somewhere special for my birthday." I felt every set of adult eyes at that table land on me at once. I kept mine on my plate. "It's exactly where it's always been," Jason said, and reached for his wine glass instead of looking at any of us, his hand closing around the stem with more force than the gesture required. Madeline's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down without eating, folded her napkin once, and didn't pick either back up for the rest of the meal. His phone buzzed against the table, face down once, then again, and he flipped it over fast enough that I caught only a fragment of the screen before he silenced it entirely. A name I didn't recognize. Under it, a single line gone before I could be certain I'd read it right. "They're waiting on your answer." He stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped hard against the floor. "Excuse me, I need to take this." He didn't wait for anyone to respond. I watched him walk out through the side door into the dark yard, phone already pressed to his ear. His free hand raking through his hair in a gesture I hadn't seen from him since he was 16 years old and failing a class he'd sworn up and down he was passing. Through the window, his silhouette paced a tight circle under the porch light, shoulders hunched, voice too low to carry through the glass, but the shape of his panic unmistakable even from a distance. The sharp jerk of his free hand, the way he stopped walking entirely at one point and simply stood there, head bowed, absorbing something on the other end of the line that had clearly cost him whatever composure he'd walked in with. Zoe watched him too small face turn toward the window and asked nobody in particular why Daddy looked so scared. Nobody answered her. Irene reached over and took Madeline's hand under the table without a word. None of us finished the meal. I didn't sleep much that night, turning over the shape of the message on Jason's phone. "They're waiting on your answer," until it wore a groove in my thinking I couldn't climb out of. By 5 in the morning, lying there, listening to Irene breathe beside me, I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. I'd told myself for 2 weeks that this was a matter for paperwork and phone calls, for Rowan's injunctions and Bobby's spreadsheets, the clean, bloodless kind of war I'd fought for most of my career. Lying awake in the dark, I understood that some part of me had never fully believed that, and had been waiting for a reason to go back out into the field. I drove into town before sunrise and parked half a block down from Jason's house, in the shadow of a neighbor's oak tree, the same kind of position I used to hold for hours at a time on surveillance details 28 years ago. I told myself I was only there to make sure he'd made it home in one piece the night before. I'm not certain that was the whole truth. The black sedan pulled up at 20 past 6, no headlights, easing to the curb the way a vehicle moves when the men inside it don't want to be noticed and know exactly how to manage that engine, dropping to an idle so quiet I almost missed the moment it stopped. 2 men got out. Not the silver-haired man from the loading dock footage, younger, both of them, built like men whose job description involved very little paperwork, dressed in the kind of forgettable jackets that don't show up clearly on a neighbor's doorbell camera. One of them walked a slow, unhurried circle around Jason's parked car in the driveway, and as he passed the driver's door, he laid his palm flat against the window glass for just a moment. No force behind it, no need for any. It was the gesture of a man reminding another man, without a single word, exactly how close he could get whenever he wanted to. Jason came out onto the porch in his robe, coffee still in hand, and stopped dead at the sight of them. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I sat, not clearly, but I didn't need to. I watched Jason's shoulders climb toward his ears. I watched him glance twice back at his own front door, checking, I assumed, that it was closed behind him, that whatever was left of his ordinary life stayed sealed off from whatever this was. I watched the taller of the 2 men say something short, and Jason's coffee mug tremble hard enough that he set it down on the porch rail rather than risk dropping it in front of them. He nodded twice, quick and small, a man agreeing to terms he had no actual power to negotiate. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. Some conversations do all their damage with proximity and patience, and these 2 understood that lesson better than most men twice their age. The whole visit lasted perhaps 90 seconds, start to finish. Then the sedan pulled away, unhurried, exactly as calm leaving as it had been arriving, and Jason stood alone on his own porch in his robe, staring after it long after it had turned the corner, his coffee going cold and forgotten on the rail beside him. My phone buzzed against my leg. Rowan, a single line, sent early enough that he must have been up watching the clock the same way I had. "Injunction is live as of 6 a.m. Accounts frozen. He'll know within the hour, if he doesn't already." He knew already. I watched him go back inside, and less than 10 minutes later, through the front window, I saw him pacing his living room with his laptop open on the table phone pressed to his ear, one hand dragging through his hair over and over, in the same gesture I'd watched at dinner 3 nights before. At one point, he sat down hard on the arm of the sofa, laptop balanced on his knees, and simply stared at the screen for a long stretch of stillness that told me more than any amount of pacing could have. I stayed another 20 minutes close enough to see, but too far to hear, and watched my son discover in real time that every account he'd been counting on to buy himself out of this had gone dark. All at once, one confirmation email after another, lighting up a screen he clearly wished would stop. His private phone, the one I'd learned from Bobby, was reserved for exactly one contact, lit up on the porch rail where he'd left it, buzzing hard against the wood, insistent, skittering an inch closer to the edge with each vibration. Jason came back outside to get it before it fell. He picked the phone up. He looked at the screen for a long moment, his whole body gone very still against the porch railing. The same stillness I'd seen in men waiting for a verdict they already knew the shape of. He didn't answer it. He stood there and let it ring and ring and ring until it stopped on its own, and even then he didn't move. Didn't go back inside, just stood on his own porch in the gray early light, holding a phone he was too afraid to pick up and too afraid to put down. I started my truck and drove home before he could look up and see me. I was back at the house before 7, letting myself in quiet enough not to wake anyone, when my phone rang again. Rowan this time, on a call instead of a text, and the moment I heard his voice I understood we'd moved into a different phase of this entire mess. "Briggs, sit down." "I'm already sitting." I wasn't, but I pulled a chair out from the kitchen table anyway, some old habit of matching my body to whatever the conversation demanded. "Jason's attorney filed an emergency petition 20 minutes ago. Temporary emergency custody. Ex parte, meaning he's asking a judge to grant it without Madeline even being in the room to respond." I sat with that a moment, letting it settle the way you let cold water settle in your stomach. On what grounds? Instability. Financial fraud allegations, the same embezzlement complaint we already know is built on forged paperwork, except now he's using it as evidence that Madeline is, and I'm quoting the filing directly, a flight risk with a demonstrated pattern of deceptive financial conduct unsuitable for unsupervised custody of a minor. Rowan's voice had gone tight, controlled in the specific way lawyers get controlled right before they stop being controlled at all. He's trying to use his own fraud as a weapon against the woman he committed it against. Can he get it granted? Not on the merits, no. Any judge who actually reads the underlying complaint is going to see exactly what we see. But an ex parte emergency hearing doesn't always get read carefully. Briggs especially filed the way this one was, late, rushed, 3 typos in the caption alone, an affidavit that reads like it was drafted at 2 in the morning by a man dictating to himself in a mirror. This has the fingerprints of a man who filed first and is planning to build the actual argument after the fact. Can we fight it? We're already filing our response. I'll have Madeline's affidavit ready by tonight, along with everything on the forged signatures and the shell company. Any competent judge sees both filings side by side. This falls apart in about 4 minutes. He exhaled, and I heard the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been awake much longer than he should have been. But 4 minutes in a courtroom is still 4 minutes. Madeline has to stand there defending herself against her own husband's fraud in front of a judge with Zoe's future sitting on the table between them. A man who filed first. I thought of Jason on that porch at dawn, phone buzzing in his hand, refusing to answer it. A man who understood on some level even he probably couldn't articulate yet, that if he lost everything else he needed one card left to play, and Zoe was the only one he had. When's the hearing? Judge granted an expedited slot. 9 days from now. Rowan paused. The night of the gala, Briggs, or the morning after, depending how you count it. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think he's planning to either fix this before then or make sure he's got Zoe in hand before anyone can stop him, one way or the other. Everyone who matters to his business and his future is going to be in one room that night. I think he means to walk out of it with something to show for all of this, even if it isn't the thing any of us would call a win. I looked out the kitchen window at the gray, early light spreading slowly over the fence line at the rick house, standing dark and quiet in the distance, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with calm. "Send me the filing," I said. "Everything. Tonight. Already in your inbox." A pause, longer this time. "Briggs, I know what I'm about to say isn't my place, but whatever this was between you and Jason before all of this, I don't think that man is thinking clearly anymore. I don't think he's thinking like your son at all right now. I think he's thinking like a drowning man, and drowning men grab whatever's closest, whether or not it's the thing that'll actually save them." I didn't have anything to say to that, because I already knew he was right. I found Madeline in the kitchen 20 minutes later, already up, already dressed, moving through the motions of making Zoe's breakfast with the careful precision of someone holding herself together one small task at a time. I told her all of it. This time, the filing, the hearing date, the language about her being unfit, unstable, a flight risk. She set down the spatula very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid you might otherwise throw. "He's using Zoe," she said. Not a question, her voice perfectly flat in the particular way that scared me more than tears would have. "After everything? After the money? After the lawsuit? He's actually going to stand up in a courtroom and use our daughter as leverage?" Rowan's already building the response. "We have the evidence, Madeline. The signatures, the shell company, all of it. This isn't going to hold." That's not the part I can't stop thinking about. She looked past me toward the stairs, toward the sound of Zoe's small feet moving around upstairs, still blissfully unaware of any of it. The part I can't stop thinking about is that he decided this was an option at all. That somewhere in his head using her was a strategy worth trying. I didn't have an answer for that either. Some things about my son I was beginning to understand I was never going to have an answer for. The 9 days that followed passed in the particular blur of people preparing for 2 different kinds of battle at once. Rowan filed our response to the custody petition, thick with exhibits and sworn statements thorough enough that even I found it hard to read without my hands going cold. Coda quietly finished cataloging every barrel Jason had touched, building a paper trail Rowan said would matter later in whichever courtroom this eventually landed in. Madeline rehearsed her testimony in the kitchen some mornings without realizing she was doing it out loud, murmuring answers to questions no one had asked her yet while she scrambled eggs for Zoe. Jason called the house twice. Neither of us answered. The afternoon before the gala, I set a small wooden box on the kitchen table in front of Madeline and sat down across from her. She looked at it, then at me, waiting. I opened it. The badge caught the late light coming through the window, tarnished silver against faded velvet, the eagle worn soft at its edges from 28 years of being handled by hands that needed reminding on hard days of exactly what they'd sworn to protect. "I was an ATF agent for 28 years, I said. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, explosives, counterfeit spirits, and trafficking mostly toward the end of it. Before that, 2 years in financial crimes, which turned out to matter more than I ever expected it would again." I let that sit a moment. "I told you and Jason both years ago that I'd worked a desk job for the government. That wasn't true. I'm sorry it took this long and this much trouble to tell you otherwise." Madeline reached out and touched the badge with one finger, careful the way you touch something you're not certain is real yet. "That's why you always seem to already know things," she said slowly, pieces visibly reassembling themselves behind her eyes. "The cameras, the signatures, finding out about the shell company before Rowan even confirmed it. That night you drove us out here without headlights until we hit the county road, and I thought at the time that I'd imagined it." "You didn't imagine it," I said. "That's exactly why." "Does Jason know about any of this?" "He knows I used to work for the government. He's never once asked what that actually meant, not in 30 years. I closed the box gently. "I'm not sure he ever wanted to know badly enough to ask. I'm not sure I ever made it easy enough for him to want to." She sat with that, a long moment quiet, and I watched her recalibrate an entire decade of assumptions about the family she'd married into every dinner, every offhand comment, every time she'd wondered privately why her father-in-law seemed to notice things nobody else in the room ever did. I picked up the phone and called Emerson Black while she was still holding the badge, catching him at his desk at the ATF field office in Louisville, a man I'd trained personally 20 years ago, back when he was a green agent barely out of the academy and had watched rise, deservedly, to run the whole division since. Briggs Williamson. Emerson's voice warmed the moment he recognized mine. "It's been too long. What can I do for you?" I told him. "Not everything. Some of it stayed mine and Madeline's to carry, but enough. The gala, the custody hearing scheduled for the same night, the very real possibility that a desperate, cornered man might do something at that event neither of us could take back afterward." Emerson didn't interrupt once, though I heard him stop typing somewhere around the part about the custody hearing. When I finished, his voice had dropped into the register I remembered from 20 years of working alongside him. Careful and absolutely certain. The register he used when a situation had stopped being theoretical. "I'll have 2 agents there in plain clothes, close enough to move fast if they need to, far enough back that nobody notices them until they have to." A pause. "Briggs, if he goes anywhere near that little girl in a way that looks like a threat, I am not going to stand there waiting on a warrant. You understand me?" "I do." "Good." Something in his voice eased just slightly. "You did the right thing calling me instead of trying to handle this alone. I know exactly how much that costs a man like you to admit, and I don't take it lightly." After I hung up, Madeline set the badge down on the table between us, gently, the way you'd set down something that had earned a measure of respect it hadn't been given in years. "What happens tomorrow if this all goes wrong?" she asked. "If it falls apart in front of the whole town, every reporter, every investor Jason's spent a year courting, what then? What happens to Zoe? Watching all of that happen to her father in front of everyone he's ever tried to impress." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered, turning the question over, the way I used to turn over a case file the night before it went to trial, looking for the one true thing I could say instead of the comfortable thing. "Then at least," I said, "the truth won't be a secret anymore. Not mine to carry alone. Not yours to carry alone either. And whatever happens to Jason tomorrow night, it will finally be the truth doing it, instead of one more lie holding the whole thing together." She nodded slowly, and neither of us pretended that was the same thing as comfort. The gala filled the old Rickhouse event barn with warm light and worse tension than warm light usually carries, a string quartet playing something bright near the entrance, while 300 guests in their good clothes drank bourbon they had no idea was in several strategic locations, cheap and fake. Reporters from 2 regional papers worked the room with notepads. Distributors who'd flown in from 3 states circled the hors d'oeuvres, waiting for the toast Jason had been promising them for a year. A photographer adjusted lights near the red-ribboned barrel at the center of the room, the one none of them knew was empty of everything it claimed to hold. I found Jason near the bar 20 minutes in a glass of something dark, already half gone in his hand, his tie slightly crooked in a way I'd never once seen from him in public. He was watching Madeline across the room the way a man watches something he's already decided to lose. Zoe stood near her mother in a dress Irene had helped her pick out that morning, delighted by the string quartet twirling once in place just to watch the skirt flare out, blessedly unaware of the 2 men in plain, forgettable jackets standing near the north exit, close enough to move fast, far enough back to be furniture to anyone who wasn't looking for them. I was crossing toward Madeline when Jason intercepted me close enough that I caught the bourbon on his breath. Real bourbon, the good stuff, drunk in quantities that suggested he'd been at it since before the doors opened. His eyes had that glassy, over-bright look of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will and finding the seams anyway. "Having a good time, Dad?" His voice carried louder than it needed to for just the 2 of us. Several heads nearby turned, the particular half-attention of people at a party who sense something might be starting. "Jason, let's step outside a minute, just the 2 of us." "Why? So you can lecture me somewhere private the way you always like to?" He raised his voice further, deliberately now. An audience gathering the way audiences gather around any raised voice in a quiet room, drawn by the particular gravity of a scene about to happen. "No, I think everybody here should hear this." Jason She stole $2.3 million. He pointed across the room at Madeline loud enough now that the string quartet actually faltered mid-phrase and finally stopped altogether. My own wife! Embezzled it right out of the company, and my father's been helping her hide it because God forbid the Williamson name take a hit 2 weeks before its own 150th birthday party. The room had gone very quiet. 300 faces turning toward us in that particular slow-motion way a crowd turns when it senses something it shouldn't look away from. Somewhere behind me I heard a reporter's pen scratch faster against a notepad. Madeline went white. She didn't move, didn't defend herself, just stood there absorbing the accusation in front of every investor and journalist Jason had spent a year courting. Her hand tightening around Zoe's shoulder without seeming to notice she'd done it. Zoe looked up at her father with an expression I never wanted to see on a child's face again. Not fear exactly, something worse. The first crack in a 9-year-old's certainty that her father was one of the good guys. I stepped between Jason and the rest of the room, my voice pitched low, meant only for him. An old instinct trying one last time to de-escalate a situation that had already moved past de-escalation. Son, not like this, not in front of her, not in front of Zoe. Something in his face came apart when I said it. Not softened, broke, the way a dam breaks, not gently and not in one clean place. Don't you dare stand there and act like the concerned father, he said. And now he wasn't performing for the crowd anymore. He was simply drowning in front of it. 300 witnesses and nowhere left to swim. You're nothing but a washed-up old-fed playing distiller, Dad. Enjoy watching your daughter-in-law go to prison for my $2.3 million mistake. The words landed in the silence like something physical. The kind of silence that has a texture, a weight, a temperature, all its own. He shoved me, then both hands flat against my chest hard enough that I lost my footing on the polished floor and went down onto one knee, catching myself against a linen-draped table that rattled a full setting of glassware in protest. For 1 full second on the floor of that barn, I was not a retired federal agent or a father running calculations about exits and threat levels. I was simply a man whose son had just put his hands on him in front of 300 strangers. And something in that particular kind of pain has no rank, no training, nothing that 28 years of discipline could soften. I have never told anyone how much that 1 second cost me, and I don't intend to start now, not even in the telling of this story. 300 people watched a son knock his 70-year-old father to the floor of a 150th anniversary gala. Nobody moved. Not the guests, frozen in the particular paralysis of people who don't yet understand what they're witnessing. Not the string quartet bows lifted and motionless. Not even for 1 full breath the 2 agents near the north exit waiting on a signal I hadn't given yet. I got to my feet slowly, unhurried, brushing the dust from my knee with one hand, and let the silence stretch exactly as long as it needed to, the way I used to let silence do its work in a room full of people waiting to see what I'd do next. You owe Titan Revis how much, Jason? I asked it quietly, the way you'd ask about the weather. But the room had gone so silent that my voice carried to every corner of that barn regardless. 300 people who moments ago had been watching a father-son argument now leaned forward as one, sensing correctly that the argument had just become something else entirely. I watched the name land on my son's face like a physical blow, watched every trace of color drain out of it in the space of a single breath. His hands, still holding the ruined remains of his drink, began to shake badly enough that a few drops splashed over the rim onto the polished floor. What did you just say? His voice had lost all its earlier bravado entirely. What remained sounded very young, almost like the voice I remembered from a boy asking me not to leave for another assignment. Titan Revis. I said it again, clearly, unhurried, letting every syllable land where it needed to. The man who runs the card rooms and the lending operation off I-71. The man whose associates paid you a visit on your own front porch 2 weeks ago at 6 in the morning in front of your own neighbors. I'd like everyone in this room to understand exactly what kind of trouble the Williamson name has actually been protecting for the past year. The murmur that moved through the crowd wasn't loud, but it was total 300 conversations starting at once, in voices pitched just below a whisper. I saw two guests near the bar quietly angle their phones upward. I saw a reporter from the Advocate stop writing entirely and simply stare the story she'd come for, having transformed into something else altogether in the space of 10 seconds. Somewhere near the dessert table, a woman in a green dress whispered the name Titan Rivas to the man beside her, and he actually laughed once in disbelief before catching himself. Rowan stood near the back of the room, where he'd positioned himself an hour earlier with a folder under one arm. And I watched him go very still, ready to move the moment anyone needed him to. He caught my eye across the room and gave the smallest possible nod, the kind two men exchange when a plan they'd only half discussed has just clicked fully into motion. Irene had one arm around Madeline, who stood frozen with a hand pressed flat against her own collarbone, breathing in the shallow, controlled way of someone forcing herself not to cry in front of 300 strangers. "You've been investigating me." Jason's voice cracked on the word investigating. Disbelief and fury tangled together into something I barely recognized as my son's voice at all. "This whole time, the cameras, whatever you've had Rowan digging through, you've been building a case against your own son in your own house while I slept under your roof. I've been trying to figure out how far you'd already fallen before you dragged everyone else down with you. Your wife, your daughter, this entire family's name. You don't know anything." He was shouting now, past caring who heard, past caring about the reporters, the investors, the decade of careful reputation he'd been protecting 20 minutes ago. "You don't know what it's like to actually need something and not be able to just wait it out with your patient little rituals and your barrels and your 28 years of pretending you're better than everyone because you used to carry a badge. You want to know why I did any of it? Do you? Because being your son was never enough on its own. It was never going to be enough, not once, not ever. So I found other ways to matter. I know you drained your own daughter's birthday out of a barrel to pay down a fraction of what you owe. I know you sold what was left of it to a man named Justice Rubio, who sold it again to collectors who will never know what they actually bought. That landed harder than anything I'd said yet. I watched it land, watched something in Jason's face go from fury to a kind of naked animal panic, the look of a man who has just understood all at once that every door in the room has quietly closed behind him. He looked for just a moment exactly like the boy who used to sit on my workbench watching me sand staves before the years and the money and the wanting had reshaped him into someone I barely recognized. His eyes swept the crowd once, wild cataloging exits the way I'd taught myself to catalog them decades ago, though he'd never once wanted that particular lesson from me. The two agents near the north exit shifted their weight almost imperceptibly, close enough now to matter. Then his eyes found Zoe. She stood exactly where she'd been standing all night, small hand still wrapped around her mother's, watching her father, with an expression that had moved past confusion into something closer to fear. She had stopped twirling in her dress a long time ago. Jason's gaze locked onto her and held, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, desperation curdling in real time into a kind of reckless, cornered calculation that I recognized immediately and hated recognizing. I had seen that exact look before, on men with nothing left to lose, and exactly one card they hadn't played yet. I had spent 28 years learning what men do in that particular moment, right before they do it, and every instinct I had left screamed at me to move. I started toward him. I didn't get there in time. Jason moved fast for a man 3 drinks past steady, cutting through the stunned crowd toward Zoe before I'd covered half the distance between us. The 300 guests parted around him the way a crowd parts around anything moving with that particular unhinged velocity, nobody quite brave enough or quick enough to intervene. He grabbed her wrist, the same gesture I registered with a cold, distant part of my mind that he'd used on Madeline's wrist so many times before, the same grip, the same desperate need to hold on to something that was trying to get away from him. "Come on, sweetheart. We're going for a ride, just you and me. It'll be an adventure, I promise." "Daddy, you're hurting me." Her voice broke on the word thin and confused the voice of a child who doesn't yet have language for what's happening to her, only the animal certainty that it's wrong. Madeline lunged toward them and froze halfway there, the particular paralysis of a mother watching a nightmare confirm itself in real time, one hand outstretched toward a daughter she couldn't quite reach, yet Irene grabbing her other arm to keep her upright. "Jason, stop!" Her voice cracked into something raw, something I'd never once heard from her before, not even in the worst of these last few weeks. "Let her go!" He didn't stop. He pulled Zoe toward the side exit, her small feet stumbling to keep up, her patent leather shoes skidding against the floor, her face twisted into the particular terror of a child who has just watched her father become a stranger right in front of her. "Grandpa!" She screamed it high and sharp, cutting through 300 frozen guests like a blade through paper. Everything in me that was still an old man fell away in that instant, and everything in me that had spent 28 years running toward exactly this kind of sound came forward to take its place. I don't remember covering the distance across that barn. I remember the doors thrown open ahead of me by one of Emerson's agents already moving. I remember the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I remember Jason's car keys already in his shaking hand, Zoe twisting against his grip in the gravel of the parking lot, under a sky full of stars she would have loved on any other night of her life, under any other circumstances at all. I caught up to him at the driver's side door just as he was wrestling Zoe toward the back seat, one hand fumbling with the door handle while the other kept its grip on her arm. I didn't hit him. 28 years of training exist for exactly this kind of moment, the moment where the goal isn't to hurt a man, but to stop him cleanly, completely, before hurt becomes unavoidable for someone smaller and more breakable than either of us. I got one hand on his wrist, the wrist not holding Zoe, and turned it at an angle the human body was never built to fight against, a technique I'd taught to 100 rookie agents over the years and had never once expected to use on my own child. Jason cried out and released her instantly, an involuntary reflex no amount of desperation could override. "Run to your mother, Zoe! Now! Run!" She ran, small feet slapping against the gravel, not looking back once, and something in me that had been holding its breath for weeks finally let go. Just slightly, just enough to keep functioning. I heard Madeline's voice somewhere behind me, sobbing her daughter's name, and heard Zoe collide into her arms a moment later, both of them going down onto the pavement together in a tangle of relief and terror. I let myself feel one full second of that relief before Jason twisted hard against my grip, and I had to bring the rest of my attention back to him. He went down onto the gravel hard, and I went down with him, keeping the pressure steady on his arm, keeping my own weight low and controlled, the way I'd been taught to do it 28 years ago, back when the men I put on the ground had a great deal more reason to fight back than my own son had reason to right now. "Let go of me!" he gasped, more sob than sentence, the gravel biting into his cheek. "Let go! Let go! I wasn't going to hurt her. I would never hurt her." "I know," I said, and meant it, and held on anyway, my knee against his shoulder blade, my whole weight, distributed the way you distribute weight when you need a man, still without needing him, broken. Around us, I was dimly aware of Emerson's agents fanning out of Rowan, already talking low and urgent into his phone, of a whole world continuing to move, while the two of us stayed locked in that one small, terrible circle of gravel. Close to my ear, low enough that only I could hear it under his own ragged breathing, he said something I wasn't ready for. "I just wanted her to remember me as somebody who tried." His voice cracked entirely on the last word. "That's all. Just once. Somebody who tried." I felt that land somewhere I didn't have armor for, somewhere 28 years of training had never once prepared me to defend. That was when the parking lot filled with the slow, silent wash of red and blue light, sweeping across the gravel, across the parked cars, across the faces of the guests who had followed us out into the night to watch, across my son's face pressed sideways into the dirt beneath me, tears cutting clean tracks through the gravel dust on his cheek. Emerson reached us, first badge already out, 2 agents fanning wide behind him in a formation I recognized instantly, muscle memory from a career I'd supposedly left behind for good. Jason Williamson. His voice carried the flat procedural calm of a man who has done this 1,000 times and still takes no particular pleasure in it. You're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, forgery, and interference with custody. You have the right to remain silent. He kept reciting the rest of it, the familiar cadence I'd said myself more times than I could count over 28 years. And hearing those exact words aimed at my own son felt like watching a photograph of my life develop in reverse. I eased my weight off my son slowly, deliberately, the way you release a valve rather than simply letting go, and stepped back to let the agents take over. One of them pulled Jason's arms behind his back, gentle enough given the circumstances, and the cuffs closed around his wrists with a sound I'd heard 1,000 times in my life and had never once expected to hear applied to my own child. Jason didn't fight them. Whatever fight had been in him had burned out somewhere back in that ballroom, or maybe out here on the gravel in the 2 sentences he'd said to me that I was going to carry for the rest of my life, whether I wanted to or not. They pulled him to his feet. He stood there swaying slightly. Gravel dust streaked across one side of his face, tears cutting clean tracks through it. And for a moment he simply looked lost. A man standing in the wreckage of a life he'd built entirely out of the wrong materials. Then his eyes found Zoe. She was still wrapped in Madeline's arms 10 feet away, her small face buried against her mother's shoulder, though she'd turned it just enough to see. Jason looked at his daughter looking at him, and whatever composure the arrest itself hadn't taken from him, that look finished the job completely. He broke down entirely. Not the calculated tears of a man performing regret for an audience I'd watched him do that earlier tonight and knew the difference instantly. This was something rawer, uglier, a grief with no polish left on it at all. The kind that comes out sideways in gasps from somewhere a man doesn't usually let anyone see. Zoe. His voice cracked apart on her name. Zoe, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, I never meant... She flinched at the sound of his voice. Not dramatically, just a small, involuntary tightening of her whole body, the kind of flinch a child develops the first time a parent stops being safe. I watched my son see that flinch and understand in real time exactly what he'd traded his daughter's trust for and exactly how little it had bought him. The agents led him toward a waiting vehicle. He didn't resist. He didn't say anything else. He just went head down, shoulders bowed, under a weight no set of handcuffs could account for on its own. I crossed the gravel to Madeline and Zoe and knelt down in front of my granddaughter, ignoring the sharp complaint of knees that had already been asked to do too much that night, once on the ballroom floor and once again on the gravel. Are you hurt anywhere, sweetheart? She shook her head, still trembling, her eyes wide and glassy in the way of a child who has just learned something about the world she can't unlearn. And then, without any warning at all, she launched herself out of her mother's arms and into mine, small arms locking around my neck with a strength that surprised me. Her face pressed hard into my shoulder the way it used to press there when she was much younger and afraid of thunderstorms. I've got you, I said into her hair, meaning it as completely as I have ever meant anything in my life. I've got you. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you. Over her shoulder, I watched the car carrying my son pull slowly out of the parking lot, taillights shrinking down the long gravel drive toward the county road, toward whatever came next for him, none of which I could protect him from anymore, none of which I was entirely sure I still wanted to. Madeline stood beside me, one hand resting on Zoe's back, the other pressed briefly against my shoulder. Not quite an embrace, but close enough to one that I understood it as thanks. I didn't need spoken aloud. Irene reached us a moment later, having pushed through the dispersing crowd of guests who were already beginning to whisper the story into 100 different versions of itself, and wrapped her arms around all 3 of us at once, the way she used to gather a family into a single unit against whatever the world was throwing at it that week. I didn't say anything. There wasn't a version of what I was feeling that fit neatly into words yet. And I've learned, over a long life spent choosing my moments carefully, that some silences aren't emptiness. Some of them are simply grief taking its time. Somewhere underneath the relief of holding my granddaughter safe in my arms, underneath the fierce gratitude of watching Madeline breathe easier than she had in weeks, there was a second, quieter thing I wasn't ready to look at directly yet. The understanding that whatever had just ended in that parking lot wasn't a victory in any way that felt like winning. It was simply the truth arriving at last, exactly as heavy as truth always turns out to be. Somewhere underneath even that, quieter still, sat the understanding that I hadn't lost my son tonight. I had lost him years ago. One absence and one silence at a time, and tonight had only been the moment the loss finally became visible enough for everyone else to see it too. I didn't say any of that to Irene on the drive home. I'm not certain I ever will. She doesn't deserve my... I held on to Zoe a while longer, watching the last of the red and blue light fade from the gravel, and said nothing else at all. Above us, entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath it, the sky over Bardstown held more stars than Zoe had ever managed to count in one sitting, and for just a moment, kneeling there in the gravel with my granddaughter's heartbeat settling slowly against my chest, that felt like the only fact in the world worth holding on to. The new barrel goes into the rack on a cold morning in November, third row from the end, same spot as before. Zoe chalks the date onto the head herself this time, her handwriting still careless with its letters, the number 9 changed to a 10. I press my palm flat against the wood the way I have 10,000 times before, rough, even, waiting. Somewhere behind us, Irene calls that the coffee's getting cold, and neither of us moves right away. I spent most of my life believing that if I gave my son everything I never had, he would turn out fine. That provision was the same thing as love, that a full bank account could stand in for the hours I wasn't there to give him instead. I know better now, though. Knowing it hasn't made the knowing painless. Love, it turns out, isn't only the giving, sometimes it's the refusing. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is stop softening the landing and let the person he loves most finally hit the ground hard enough to learn how to stand back up on his own. I don't know if God forgives a father for the mistakes he didn't know he was making until it was too late. I pray most nights that God does not for my sake, but for Jason's, wherever he's serving out these years now. I know God is still writing the rest of this story in ways none of us can see yet. I only know that the family still standing in this kitchen is safe and loved, and some mornings, that has to be enough. If it had been your own child standing in that parking lot, the one you raised, the one you loved before you knew what love would cost you, would you have done what I did? Would you have called it in, or found one more excuse to look away? I still don't know the right answer. I only know the one I chose. If this story found something true in you, tell me about it in the comments below and stay with us for the next one.